This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Truth Be Told. Today, my guest is McKenah Elizabeth. McKenna is a sales and communication expert and coach. Starting her career in education as a teacher, then spending time in recruiting, and then eventually working for several years in the IT and tech space as an account executive. Now, you might see her viral videos on TikTok or LinkedIn or Instagram. As a content creator and a coach, McKenna provides value for brands looking to get their products in front of consumers, as well as providing consult to professionals who want to become more confident in their sales relationships and their communication skills. On this episode, we're going to discuss the importance of rapport, building relationships, handling objections, and the crossover between sales conversations, investigative interviews, and everyday interactions with other people. Let's dig right into this episode. Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. I am your host, Dave Thompson. I am here with my friend, McKenna Elizabeth. How are you today?
Fabulous. Thanks for having me, Dave.
Absolutely. I want to say I met McKenna because the TikTok algorithm kept driving me to your viral videos about sales and communication. But before we get into that, maybe you can just explain a little bit of what you're doing now and kind of what brought you there.
Yeah, so I'm a full-time content creator now, and I talk a lot about sales, communication, tonality, how to connect with customers, and just give different creative tips for what I've learned in my own sales experience, but also like what I'm seeing other people put out there on LinkedIn and other places, just to really provide an educational experience for people in sales in all different industries, whether it be med device, real estate, tech, solar, and just develop a community on socials.
Sales, like the whole, I hate sales. I mean, you probably hear that a lot. But sales is so much more than that. I feel like your strength, from what I've seen, is really just communication in general. You're just using it in the sales vertical. So what brought you into being interested in that concept in the first place? Like, it was sales always something that just drove a passion for you?
Well, actually, I set out to be a elementary education teacher, and that's what my degree is in. And I love teaching. That's like my favorite thing to do. I love presenting ideas in ways that other people can understand, and breaking things down and making them easy to consume and implement. And that's something that when I decided, hey, I don't think education is for me. One, just because the public education system has just changed so much. It's just different than how it used to be. There's a lot of pressure on teachers, a lot of responsibility, and also I needed to make money. I had student loans, and I needed to be able to pay them myself, and so I had to figure out what's going to give me the most upside for financials, and that was sales. And so got into recruiting, then moved into sales within that same company. And then, moved into work for a SaaS company and did sales there. And so just kind of saw it in different companies, how it can change, how it can shift, because some things are more transactional, some things are more relational, depending on what you're selling. And so really wanted to speak to kind of the different sales scenarios that I've seen and kind of how I've had to adjust even my own self and my approach to calls.
Yeah, so recruiting, if we want to spend a minute on that, because I know we've got a lot of people in the human resources field that listen to this podcast. I feel like recruiting is a sales job half the time, right? You're selling the brand and the company and the position. Is there a lot of those same skills that you feel like have crossed over?
Absolutely. Recruiting prepared me so well for sales, because you're always on LinkedIn anyway. You are when you're in sales too. You're figuring out how to ask questions and how to really understand somebody's experience and their background, and you're doing the same thing when you're in sales, but you're coming at it from, you tell me about your company landscape and your problems and some areas you're looking to improve, initiatives, goals, all those things. And so just learning how to ask good open-ended questions in recruiting, same with sales.
Get into the sales space, and I know as we've talked, in tech sales was really where were spending most of your time. Do you think, as we listen, our listeners are a variety of people, right? We got people that do investigations, so they're trying to talk to people and get information that they don't want to give. We have HR people who are doing the same or trying to recruit somebody. And we might have people who are just trying to engage in conversations with other humans and trying to get them to buy into themselves, a relationship, a product, whatever. How much do you feel like the product that you're selling changes the concepts we're going to go over, like open-ended questions and how do you interact with somebody? Is it product specific or is it more relational?
So I think I have a
I know, I loaded question.
when I compare selling a service, that's maybe like a consulting service or staffing or things like that. Maybe that's billed like time and materials that can be customizable to a company's needs versus a product. I think there's two different approaches with that. Like, I think services, relationships matter so much more because anybody could mow your lawn and do your landscaping. Anybody can sell you a house that's a realtor. Anybody can, build you a custom web application for the most part. And so, do they trust you is really like super, super important in services. And so you're really selling yourself and the trust value just as much as you're selling like your deliverables. And then in product, like you have a product. This is the product you have to sell. It's going to meet their need or it's not going to meet their need. They can like you a ton, but if the product doesn't do what it's supposed to do or it doesn't fit the pain point, it doesn't matter, right? So it's not that relationships have zero value and trust has zero value in product sales, but I think there's a lot more there should be a bigger focus on discovery and getting your customers' pain points and getting them to trust you enough to tell you what they care about. But being likable, it's not going to close your deal the way it would in services.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned trust, which I think is really important. When we're out there training on interviewing or investigative interviewing or interrogations, it's really the common denominator is when you have good rapport with somebody and you develop this genuine, sincere trust and they respect you as a person, you're more likely to get information in that conversation. But I feel like rapport is such a buzzword and people don't know what the hell does that mean? Do I just like, when we first talked, it wasn't just let's talk about the weather for 20 minutes. That's not really rapport. So I'm sure you could talk forever about this, but what does rapport actually look like? And do you think people are good at that in the sales space?
Yeah, I think the first step to building rapport, if you're meeting a customer or prospect, is showing like sort of like a guard, like letting down your guard. I think a lot of salespeople think that they need to come in with this like professional, like, good to meet you, fabulous, thanks so much for your time. And they're just like putting on this like production. That I think is one thing that like creates a barrier because then the customer is like, oh, well, they're putting on this face. I need to put on this face, right? And I'm going to hold my cards to my chest because they're not just sitting down with me and be like, hey, like, tell me about your business, like what's going on, and having that like genuineness and just realness. So be real so that your customer is going to be real with you. And then, so that's a big part of rapport. But then also too, like, I love to like laughter and humor is a part of the way that I build rapport. And it's not even like that I'm the jokester, but like I just like think other people are funny. And I think having that just like humorous conversations can also break down walls and barriers between people and realizing like that, I'm just a human in sales. You're just a prospect in HR and we have more in common than we think we do. And so sharing jokes, sharing laughs, whatever, super important.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. A direct correlation to investigations because when you just described, if a salesperson walks in and they're fulfilling salesperson role, that means their job is to convince somebody else to spend money on something. The customer, their job is to say no, right? Try to get the best deal. Their job is to probably be, and in an investigation when you walk in with that same mentality, it's like the investigator's job is I need to get somebody to give me information that's not good for them. And bad guy's job is to deny and resist. And so instead, if we all walk in with this concept of like, I'm just a human fulfilling this role, let's just have two people communicate, we can find more common ground if that seems to relate.
Yeah. And that's the other thing is like I feel like people are afraid to tell salespeople really what's going on or like all of the pain because they think that that's like revealing too many cards or something like that, you know? And
Right.
maybe that's true in like car sales, right? Like you don't want to tell them everything in your budget and your monthly stuff and your trade-in value. But like in software sales, like tell me everything. Like it's not going to change the price, you know. It's not going
Right.
to hurt you to tell me everything. If anything, it's going to help me give you everything you need or even determine if it's a right fit for us to be, you know, working together at all. Um, and so I think there's more in it for the customer just to like, hey, here's what's going on. Can you help us or not?
Yeah. In that beginning part of a conversation, because I know a lot of people struggle with rapport. And you talk a lot about this in your videos, like especially on TikTok, but a lot about just people engaging with other people, and especially I mean everything from like the introductory line in an email to the first 5 minutes on a cold call. But a lot of people struggle with that. They're not good in social situations. They're not good engaging with people that they don't know. And so, what is your opinion on walking into these conversations with a script, right? With here's like the first three questions I'm going to ask every time, or here's how I'm going to do manage every conversation. And is that I feel like for me that would handcuff my ability to be adaptable during a
Yeah.
conversation. But is that something that's helpful for people who struggle with it?
I think a framework is great. So one of the things that I used to get dinged on and early on in my career is that I didn't spend enough time in bonding and rapport. Like that, I'm just like a high D, high I. So I'm just like, so tell me everything, you know, da, 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 and I would just jump right into all of my
Right.
questions and like not take the time to like go through you know, have a basic human bonding moment or have an agenda. I would just be like, so tell me about your role, like right off the bat. And my boss would be like, you have to slow down and spend
Right.
some time to like ease them into it, right? Like, not everybody's like just gonna boom, jump right into something. Um, so my framework became like bonding and rapport, spend a couple minutes on that, and then you know kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about, kind of how the rest of the call is going to go, share a little bit about my background to show credibility and what I've done and who I work with, and then kind of move into, okay, so I know we're kind of here to talk about this general topic. Can you paint a picture for me or like give me a broad overview of your current problem with this or like how your current process is in this area of your business? And so kind of go broad and then get narrow and narrow and narrower as the conversation kind of unfolds. So that's my framework, is to start big and then get really, you know, small after that. But I don't have like, it depends on what I'm talking, like what who I'm meeting with. If I'm talking to a CFO, if I'm talking to an HR manager,
Yeah.
I'm gonna have a different lead-in question after I kind of spend some time in rapport and the agenda and my introduction.
Yeah, I like the term framework instead of script because, I was just on a call about a month ago with, it was a salesperson trying to sell us a product, and they asked me during the conversation if I had filled out a March Madness bracket, and I did not because it's going to be wrong anyway. So I just said no, I didn't. I didn't waste time this year.
Yeah.
But the next question was, well, who do you have winning the tournament? I was like, wait a second. I just told you no, but it felt like to me it was somebody just had a robotic like script. I'm going to ask this guy these questions and clearly did not care. My answer did not change their conversation at all.
Yeah, that does, and you notice that when you interview people too, like hosts, like the best hosts, like Oprah or like they're listening enough to like change the follow-up questions or like dig deeper into something that somebody specifically said instead of just like going through a bullet
Right.
list of questions. And I'm sure that's true with like interrogation.
Right.
You're trying to actually listen to what they're saying and dig into that, right? Versus just having an agenda.
Right. Did I think, just so everybody's clear, I'm pretty sure you just compared me to Oprah. Is that what we just did? I'll take it. I'll just pretend. But yeah, the you're right. Investigators, I think one of the biggest mistakes investigators make is, and it's probably in sales, you can let me know if this translates, but it's this confirmation bias or tunnel vision where you have somebody who maybe you suspect of a crime or whatever, and you ask a question and they give you an answer that might contradict your evidence, right? Maybe you have a witness that said McKenna robbed the gas station, but when I ask you about, tell me about what you were doing on Friday, and you've got a pretty good alibi, you were somewhere else, I should dig into that further and listen and say, well, tell me more about that, right? What do you mean you were at dinner? How was dinner? But instead, investigators are like, no, I know you were there, so I'm going to keep saying you were there. I think that would probably relate to the sales process of maybe not listening to the customer and adapting or flexing your pitch or your engagement based off their response.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I was just getting newer salespeople that don't know their product or service well enough. They don't know what question to ask next sometimes, like to dig deeper. They're like, I don't even know what the next thing to ask them would be. So it's hard because you you have to kind of have somebody supporting you just to know what the deeper level or the next question to ask would be, unless you use something broad like you said, like tell me more about that or walk me through what that looks like for you, just very like paintbrush questions.
Right. So that's a good point too. I think even in just relationships, friendships, whatever it might be, you're meeting somebody at a networking event for the first time. People that are good salespeople, you can pick them out at these types of events. You can pick out that person at the bar because they have the ability to ask a question. Like if you and I are talking and I could, hey, tell me about your job, and you'd start talking. If immediately I just ask another close-ended question or I start telling you about my job, that's more work for me, right? I got to think, oh, great, what am I going to ask next? How do I contribute? But if I can just keep asking you, well, tell me more about that, or what do you mean by that, or explain that better or describe that to me,
Yeah.
it's so much less pressure on me as the host and more on the person providing information.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the things that was super transformational for me when I learned that, I was listening to like the podcast called The Art of Charm, and one of the things that like set that approach, like cemented that in my brain of just the value of asking people about themselves, like and going deep, is that dopamine releases in people's brains when they get to talk about themselves and share like what they're passionate about, what they do, and they'll actually like you more even if you say nothing about yourself, just because you asked them about
Right.
them and cared enough to go deeper than like the surface level basic questions and move on. And so I'm like, well, likability in sales, like, or in life or in dating or whatever, just asking people good questions, like that's doable.
Yeah, you gave a good example. I know we'll talk about this a little bit, but I recommend people follow you on TikTok for some of these clips. But you gave a good example of, asking somebody like their job, and a person responds by saying, "Oh, I'm an engineer," and typical the reciprocation there, reciprocal response is me just saying, "Okay, and here's my job." But the much easier thing to do that you describe, and I'll let you get into this further, but is just kind of like, well, tell me more. What is that like? What kind of engineer? And the information comes from them instead. So what's the point of that? What's the purpose of having a conversation that way?
Just opening people up, showing genuine interest in like being a curious person. Like that's the best way to build, like go beyond the surface level with relationships. And to me, like, and probably to you, like once you get good at it, it's like you doing anything else feels wrong. Like you're like, because you have this skill set and you know how to use it. And so you're like, if I don't use it, like I'm being lazy, or I'm off my game or whatever else. And you almost, like, for me, I feel guilty like if I don't go deep with somebody. And also I get bored like just talking about the surface level stuff. So
Yeah.
it'd be a great way to make conversations, I think, just more interesting for everybody.
And more real, right? They're so superficial. When you ask close-ended questions, you're even if you're talking to somebody who's a truthful person or whatever, you're narrowing the scope. Like if I wanted to know about your weekend, if I said, "Hey, where'd you go to dinner Saturday night?" You might just give me a name of a restaurant. If I said, "Hey, tell me about your weekend," it allows you to elaborate on what was your experience, what was like the highlight reel of your weekend, and what you're comfortable sharing, and then it allows me to ask further questions about it. So it's so much easier, honestly, as a host, as an interviewer, or just as a somebody trying to build a relationship, to let the other person actually talk, and you have to actually listen to their response, which I know is difficult for some people.
What do you feel like? Where do you feel like you use the question and like the digging deeper most in like your personal life?
I think it's anything from a networking event to like meeting somebody new for the first time, or even just having conversations with friends. I feel like I've gotten so much better through interviewing that I ask more broad, open-ended questions. Let somebody freely tell a story, because interrupting somebody just ticks people off. It impacts their memory, their ability to tell a story. Um, and then I'm like conditioning them. This is the only part of your story that matters to me. Versus like, let me actually just listen to you collect this information, provide it, and then I'll follow up. It also, honestly, I think comes across a little interrogative, right? If it's like, well, where were you? Who were you with? What time did you get back? What were you doing? Versus, hey, tell me about your night. Right? It allows you to
Mm,
choose what's more important to you.
yeah, that's a good point.
Do you get accused or utilize your sales techniques in your personal life?
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, you can't unlearn it. It just becomes a part of your communication style. I will say though, like by nature, I am like a really like high energy, like guess what happened, and like, or I have this interesting story, like with my friend circle, and I am very like an outgoing person, so I'm very talkative, in my social life, and in at work I or like in my job is to listen and ask good questions, and so I do get like probably more expressive on the social side, but then I reel it back in because I'm like, oh, I'm talking too much, like I'm supposed to be asking questions about them, and there is that self-correction moment where I'm like, oh my gosh, like I do this all day, like I should be really really good at it, and I am, but you kind of pent up all your own stuff, like because you're listening all day, so then when you're with people you care about, you're like like I have so much to tell you, and so it is that balance. Like I think about when you call your family or whatever, and you're catching up with them, like how often do sometimes we just let it run, we just let ourselves go for it because we're not constantly like thinking about, oh, what's my next question. You're not as you don't have as clear of a goal as you do maybe in a sale, or in an interrogation. I don't know, do you feel like you're the
Yeah.
same way,
Yeah.
or how are you?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think it's helped me become a better communicator in personal life, but it's so important to have a social circle that you can just download afterwards and just not be on, and just be completely yourself and genuine, and not worry about it. You A lot of what you were just discussing is like the self-awareness, right? Is your self-correcting of like, oh shit, I just asked too many closed-ended questions, or I forgot to let them talk about themselves, or whatever. But you talk in some of your videos about the importance of mentorship, and maybe having somebody else listen in on a conversation or give you feedback or critique. What have you learned in that process, or any advice on the importance of mentorship?
So I've been really fortunate to have worked for a lot of female leaders in my career, and so have had mentorship from them, and I think that through that I've seen more of like a late, like you're driving the conversation, but almost in a way that people don't even realize it's happening. Whereas I think with the male training that I've had, or been, it's more like direct, like here's what we're doing, da 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 da, and being very like systematic in everything that you do. And but I will say, like, call reviews have been so amazing for me. The first 6 months in my first sales job, my manager either listened to all my calls or like went on calls with me and then would debrief after. Here's how you could have peeled back the layers more. Here's where you could have dug deeper, and then got that later on in my career too. And that was super helpful for me because I started to realize, where I could be improving. And I think without any feedback, had I never had anybody, correct me and for the purpose of making me better, I don't know how I would have grown, because I wouldn't even realized what I was doing wrong, or maybe, where I could be getting more information.
Yeah, that part of what you could be doing wrong, I know in the investigative space, and I'm going to ask you if this relates to sales. A lot of times, people are judging their success of the interview whether or not they got an admission or a confession, which is not the right way to evaluate success, because in this space, right, you might interview somebody and find out that they're innocent, or maybe they didn't give you information, but you at least developed a relationship with that person that they might give you information next time, or trust. But when it comes to evaluating from like a sales conversation, I guess it depends on the environment, but are you measuring success based on did I close a deal, or are there other elements of that you're going to look at to say that was a successful interaction?
I mean, as a salesperson, because of your metrics and everything, we tend to do the same thing. Like, did you close the deal or not? Like,
Right.
what's the dollars? Because that's really what the company cares about. But I did have a manager that really challenged me to think differently. Like, yeah, you might have lost this sale, but you learned how to do this better, or like because you did this early on in the conversation, like this is what led to them sharing this with you, which led to an introduction to their CFO. And how can you do that more in more calls, and like taking things that worked really well and then just re-implementing them in another sales cycle, and using it as like, yeah, what I got out of it wasn't money, but it was a better strategy, a better approach.
Yeah, well, and we work in a relatively small industry, so a lot of the same vendors, a lot of the same solution providers and salespeople, we work with over decades, and they might work at a different organization at some point. And so, for us, developing that relationship and knowing that maybe right now isn't the best time for somebody because of budget constraints or whatever, but if I've developed trust and a relationship, then when the opportunity does come up, I'm a good person for them to come back to, or that vendor is a good person for us to reach back out to. And it's the same in the investigative space, right? I feel like, let me ask you this. Have you ever had a sales conversation? This is a time for a confessional. Here's a little interrogation of McKenna. Have you had, have you ever had a sales conversation or a deal where it closed successfully, but maybe you didn't think it was the right deal for the customer? Like it was almost felt like you were able to pressure somebody into something that maybe it wasn't right at the moment. Of course, not in your current position. We're talking about something that anonymously would have happened at some point.
Yeah, I can think of like one specific example where I'm like, I sold the software, and I got them training to like implement it, and put their team through that training. But
Right.
look, in hindsight, I was like, you know what, like it probably would have been better for a third party to do this that has more experience, more technical experience. Like this is probably going to be a lot longer of a process for them because they're doing it a self implementation. And so like in hindsight thinking like, I might have been better to just take the time to like say, hey, no, like you really do need to buy services, instead of being like, oh, I won't make them pay for
Right.
services. I'll figure out another way. And so that's one thing that in tech all the time, you're trying to think of how can I set this customer up for success. And sometimes maybe we let things go that we're afraid is going to make the price tag bigger, which could potentially make the sale go under. And so we're constantly evaluating like, oh, is this gonna ruin my deal?
Right. Yeah, and I guess in the tech space, because you're selling something that you're going to have a long-term relationship with somebody. It's probably a product that you're going to have to service or continue to be available and build that relationship. I'm picturing like the one-time purchase, the car salesman or car saleswoman who, you go to the dealership and this person sells you a vehicle but you leave thinking like, damn, I didn't feel like I even had a voice in that conversation, like almost this immediate buyer's remorse afterwards.
Mm,
And I would imagine that's not a salesperson I would go back to 3 years later if I had. If, I would rather not buy the car now, but that person developed enough of a good, trusting relationship with me that I'm gonna refer friends and family who are also in that interest of buying a car to go to that person. So that trying to like differentiate this high pressure selling, high pressure interrogation might get you the immediate gratification, but then long term, what are you really accomplishing?
yeah, and you know, the power of belief in sales is so so important. Like you have to really really believe that the product or solution that you're selling is going to make a difference, a positive difference for that customer, for their business or whatever. To really come across fully genuine, and even like it just comes across in your tone and in everything you do. I find it insanely hard, but I'm sure there are people out there that can do it, to sell somebody something without the power of belief. Like I have to believe in it, like totally in the solution, to
Right.
like to become that direct with somebody. But some people are like, there are psychopaths out there in this world that are that can totally like play the game and do that. But like when you're, I don't know, it could be a cultural thing, but like in the Midwest, like your word is like your bond, and like your reputation matters, and like there's a lot of core values that are like instilled in you that like just about being like a good trustworthy person. And so like that can eat at you, like
Yeah.
so
Yeah, I think I'm gonna shift topics a little, but you just said something that triggered it for me. Is you mentioned this earlier about having a mentor who is a woman and kind of the difference, gender difference maybe, and how people approach a certain situation. And I know I've seen again some of your videos and your support and consulting out there is also for maybe women in the sales industry,
mhm.
and you talk also about like have people not felt confident in a meeting or not felt confident to speak up. And so I'm asking you because we get a lot of questions, um, whether it's age, gender, race, but people that enter into a situation where they don't feel like they're in a comfortable situation, they're not amongst their peers, and they have to, you know, become credible or become known in the right way. So I guess my long-winded question is if you had advice specifically to women, young women out there who are maybe nervous in some of these situations of how do I appear confident and do it the right way? What am I missing? What are some of the key, I guess, takeaways you'd have there?
Yeah, I think an introduction is an important part, like a solid intro into your background and who you are, assuming that you have some credibility in the space, because people aren't just going to give that to you like they would a man. Like a man can walk in the room and they're probably just going to assume, oh, he's got a little gray hair, he's been, whatever, he's probably been doing this for a long time. People give you the benefit of the doubt. But when you're young and you're a woman, you aren't gonna walk in the room, and people aren't gonna assume that you're a credible source. So your intro has to be solid in when you're meeting new customers for the first time. Like, hey, like, and I used to work with a lot of celebrity brands, and so when I do my introduction, I'll be like, hey, I've worked with, I've worked with all the Kardashian brands. I've worked with Tom Brady's brand. I've worked with Scarlett Johansson's brand. And I'm here to offer my, expertise in the e-commerce integration space. And so I would just like establish myself with that, just right off the bat. And then people are like, oh, okay, like she knows something, she can speak to certain things. Whereas if I just kind of like went straight into the meeting, um, I wouldn't get that credibility.
Yeah. The gray hair comment, I mean, were you talking about somebody specific that right now? I mean, because people are just listening to this. So she wasn't referring. I mean, you're talking about the beard, which is fine. That's okay. I'll let it. I'll let it slide. You've first compared me to Oprah, and now we're talking about gray hair.
It all balances out. No, I think gray hair is great. Like I think that there's a lot of credibility that comes with grays.
So everybody, if you didn't listen to anything else, the last 30 seconds is how you handle resistance from your potential customer. You just turned that into a positive. That was well
Yeah.
done.
Oh yeah.
You talk a lot about that too, about like fear of rejection, or you do get denials, meaning a denial can be anything from I don't have the budget right now, or it could be pretty direct, like, hey, can you get to the damn point? I don't have time for this meeting right now. I'll give you 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
That to me, if I was in a position, a sales position, it's kind of like as an interviewer, that's my biggest fear is how do I walk in and the first thing they say is like, F you, I don't got time for you. What am I going to say next? And so we could probably spend forever on all these different types of objections, but any high level feedback or discussion points on how can I be prepared to hit resistance?
Mm-hmm. A lot of that will come up on like cold calls, or like initial kind of interactions. That's where you get the most resistance. Like once you have somebody on a meeting, they agreed to be there, and so you don't get as much of
Right.
it. Assuming that you're direct and you're, setting the stage right, but um, you know, people will say, "Oh, send me an email," right? And you can say, "Actually, that's exactly why I called. I did, I sent an email earlier, and I just felt like it was probably too vague. Like, I really wanted to really explain to you what it is that we do over the phone to see if it would make sense for your company." And so, like, really just embracing the objection. No matter what they say, like, oh, we don't have budget. Well, that's exactly why I called, is because I want us to have conversations now so that we can make this a part of your budget going into the next year or the next quarter if you really feel like what we have for you is valuable. And that way you can just kind of like always, if you always know you're going to say that, that kind of buys you time to figure out what you're going to say next.
Yeah. Well, and what I like about that, and it goes with what you said earlier, is even though it's kind of prepared remark, it's like it's a prepared counter, but
Mm-hmm.
you're also listening to what their concern was. So you're addressing that need, right? Like I think about in an interview, somebody might say, I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to get involved, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this like, I don't want to get involved might be a sign that I don't want people to know that I'm the one giving up information. Like I'm nervous about who's going to hear about this. And
Yeah.
so when you the interviewer can hear that denial, but then you can respond to it with, I understand this is difficult to talk about, or absolutely, we're going to keep this on a need to know basis. They give you a concern, but you can actually immediately address that concern and keep the conversation going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's such a balance because having like a rebuttal and being like, well, actually no, or like, being very like combative
Right.
in the objection can actually create more resistance. So like just figuring out how you can embrace it and kind of like affirm what they're saying.
Yeah, and that used to be old school interrogation techniques, right? As somebody you say, McKenna says, no, I didn't do it, and old school would be like, put my hand up and say, McKenna, I don't want to hear that right now, and be combative and
Mm-hmm.
confrontational and redirect.
Mm-hmm.
But in today's society, and what the research shows is instead, when you say, I don't want to talk about this right now, or I didn't do it, hey, I know this is difficult to talk about. Tell me why you're feeling that way. And
Mm-hmm.
instead of just like accepting a denial or resistance, like let's listen to the explanation. Last, I know we're up on time, but I want to make sure just a couple more minutes to talk about what you're doing now, because I think it's really important that our listeners know how they can obviously find more about you. But you've entered this influencer life, and all these little kind of tidbits of information we're doing right now is you're putting out on TikTok, and LinkedIn, and also all the other socials. But what has that experience been like of putting out a 90-second, 30-second video, and getting that immediate feedback?
I love creating content and I love the immediate feedback. And I think that's why I like social media so much, is because the data will immediately tell you what resonated with people. You get instant responses. And I like that. I like that instantaneous visibility. So that's why I enjoy creating content. But I also really like creating content for other brands and to bring awareness to other products, because I've had the opportunity to work with Salesforce and Amazon Web Services, Panda Express, and some other companies over the course of my TikTok journey, and if they have a great product, a great certification, a great program, like I would love to share that with my audience. That's something that I'm very passionate about, and I want to use my platform to point people in directions for tools or programs that could really help them take the next step.
Well, I think that's what was really impressive to me, just in sales in general, but everything you're doing is, you mentioned earlier, yes, you have to believe in the product and you've got a great product, but your ability to just promote or discuss the benefits of something, regardless of what that something is. Right? It's more about the relationship building and building the content around it, and that's clearly a strength of yours. So I recommend people follow you, and I'll let you kind of list the best ways to do it because I'm sure I'll screw up all your different handles. But I know that's how I engaged with you, and I'm learning all the time because although we have a lot of investigators listening, we're all communication specialists. That's the focus really of this podcast and kind of what our listeners are interested in. So if you want to learn more about communication, how can we find McKenna?
Yeah, so you can find me if you're on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn is McKenah Elizabeth Johnson. McKenna is spelled really wonky, so McKenah. That's the same. And then with my TikTok is McKenna.Elizabeth, my Instagram, McKenna.Elizabeth.pro, YouTube, McKenna.Elizabeth, same wonky McKenna spelling. It'll be in the show notes. And so I primarily use TikTok and LinkedIn the most for content. You can also email me on those platforms if you...
I think Wonky McKenna should be your new handle.
Wonky McKenna.
Yeah.
I like it.
No, I think that's great, and I want to we'll put all those tags in our show notes as well. So if you're listening, be easy for you to find and follow, and of course subscribe to the podcast for future episodes. But before we sign off, I'm going to give you one last question, as we've asked all of our guests if there's kind of one last piece of advice or feedback that you want listeners to walk away with from your experience as it relates to communication. What would that be? And I know it's a loaded question after everything we talked about, but
yeah.
One piece of feedback for listeners.
Going back to what I said earlier, like just having human moments and showing your humanness in connection. And for me, like humor and laughter and smiling and all those things, like just not having the whole presentation, tough guy, tough girl, walls up all the time, and, be more of you and less of your title.
Yeah, I love that. Just be yourself. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and spending some time with me and with our listeners. I appreciate your all the info you shared. And thank you all for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And to keep this conversation going, follow the Truth Be Told podcast on LinkedIn and Truth Be Told CFI on Twitter. On behalf of the International Association of Interviewers, Rick Lander-Zalowski, and our valued sponsors, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast.